let me share a little bit about Adana today. She is a community educator, organizational development consultant, advocate, and scholar. Her work focuses on harnessing the power of narrative to create a more inclusive, just, and equitable community. A seasoned professional speaker and facilitator, Adana has a unique talent for complex and emotionally charged subjects accessible to diverse audiences. Using a combination of data, storytelling, and a healthy dose of Black girl magic, Adana creates safe spaces for critical analysis, experiential learning, and deep conversation. By honoring the need to balance emotional honesty with a sharp analysis and strategic action, Adana brings a holistic and person-centered approach to this work. Her expertise lies in applying an intersectional lens to social equity issues, resulting in nuanced and comprehensive analysis and the development of innovative solutions. Adana comes to this work as a disabled Black mixed-race mother raising disabled kids. It is this life experience that gives Adana unique insight into the ways that racism, sexism, ableism, and other systems of oppression interact with and enforce each other. Her passion for inclusive movement building towards co-liberation comes from her lived experience with the truth that all oppression is connected. Adana holds degrees in organizational leadership and political science and is currently working hard earning her master's degree here at Seattle University in public administration. A sought after speaker, consultant, and facilitator, she's worked with organizations across the country to challenge systems of oppression and facilitate the creation of spaces for inclusion and belonging. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Carol. I'm nervous too, so we'll be nervous together. It's all right. Hey y'all, great to see you. I'm Adana, my pronouns are she, her. By way of description, as Carol mentioned, I'm a Black mixed race woman. I'm 39 years old. I've got brown skin, curly blonde hair at the moment. We'll see what color it is next week. Who knows? I'm wearing glasses with blue frames and bright pink lipstick. I'm coming to you from my living room. So there's some clutter in the back, bookshelves, houseplants, kids' toys, COVID life. And I'm just so grateful to be here. I'm grateful to Carol. I'm so grateful to Rashmi and to Mary Jo, who are people who work to make it possible for me to be here with you today. And I also want to just lean into that interdependence for a moment and name into the room, bring into the room other folks whose labor makes it possible for me to be here today. People like my partner, Orion, who is currently tending to our kids so that I can be relatively free of distraction. He's got the dogs outside again, so I can be relatively free of distraction. We'll see how long that lasts. But I also think about people whose labor I benefit from, but who I will never see or never meet, right? Like folks across the world, especially concentrated in the global South, who have done the work to make the computer that I'm using, or who have done the work to make the clothes that I'm wearing. And so I would just like to offer an invitation for us to take a moment and think a thought of gratitude to someone whose work makes it possible for you to be here in relative safety and comfort. And if you feel called to do that, go ahead and shout them out in the chat. This is awesome. I'm seeing some caregiving support. I'm seeing bosses stepping in to cover so that folks can be here. This is fantastic. Please feel free to keep this going as long as you want. You can do this the whole time. So I've been thinking a lot about interdependence throughout the pandemic, thinking a lot about how we're all so connected and so reliant upon each other. And the other thing from the pandemic that I did, like a lot of folks, is that I adopted a couple of new hobbies. I've done two of the big three. I got a pandemic puppy. That's him. That's Daniel with my son Langston, all snuggled up. He's very cute. We got Daniel on election day, which was a wonderful distraction. And I started a garden. I have not learned to make sourdough, but maybe if the Delta variant turns out to be as bad as we fear, then I'm probably going to need some carbs. So maybe I'll learn to make sourdough then. But the one that I want to talk about of the three is gardening. The garden has been my greatest teacher. It continues to be my greatest teacher. I'm in the garden every day. I can actually see the garden right now through my window from where I'm sitting right now. And that's by design that I put my desk here. It's thanks to the garden that I more deeply understand disability justice and the opportunities that it can create. Because gardening is all about conditions. It's all about co-creating the conditions necessary for something to thrive. And I say co-creating because when we work with living things, there's a demand of humility. We have to understand that we can shape the conditions, we can influence the conditions, but we don't control them. I like to borrow from Albert Einstein here that if we look deep into nature, we'll understand everything better. I find that to be so, so true. When I'm a little bit lost, the garden is where I go. When I see a plant struggling in the garden, I do not blame the plant. I don't say that the plant should just work harder or the plant should just photosynthesize faster. I examine the conditions. I look for the barriers. I tinker, I fiddle, I make adjustments, and I try to figure out what is it that needs to shift so that this plant can thrive. And can I make that shift in a way that's holistic, that honors the needs of everything else in the ecosystem? And that requires a lot of really deep noticing. It requires a lot of seeing, and it requires a sense of responsibility on my part for being responsible for shaping those growing conditions, right? Instead of just saying, oh, well, looks like that plant's just not gonna live this season and I'll plant something else. I try to take responsibility for the soil and what's happening in the soil. And that teaches me these amazing lessons that really parallel my experience with disability. Lessons about moving at the pace of nature, about honoring the capacity of a living thing, and about celebrating the diverse range of ways that we can measure success. And the more that I garden, the more that I'm understanding the wisdom of disability justice, the gifts of anti-ableist practice, and the possibilities that are unlocked when we commit to cultivating the necessary conditions for all of us to thrive. The pandemic really revealed for me that our organizations, and this shouldn't have been a surprise, but unfortunately it was kind of a surprise. The depth of it, I suppose, was a surprise. Our organizations have not historically created conditions necessary for disabled people to thrive. And if we'd done that, if we'd been centering disability from the beginning, we would have been much better positioned to manage the challenges of the pandemic, which is a bold claim, but I promise I will back it up. So I want to walk through some key principles of disability justice and the opportunities that they present for moving forward together. But first, I want to back up and define a couple of terms and make sure that we're all understanding these words in the same way. So first, disability. I love this word. I love how vast disability is. I love how flexible it is. According to the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, a disability is any impairment, cognitive, psychological, or physical, that impacts activities of daily living and that lasts longer than 6 months. That's it. So that's broad enough to include kids in Flint, Michigan, who have acquired learning disabilities from several thousand days without clean drinking water. And that's broad enough to include neurodiverse folks like my son, Langston, who's autistic. And that is broad enough to include someone like my dad, who's a Vietnam War veteran and has chronic illness from exposure to Agent Orange. It's broad enough to include someone like my mom, who's getting on in years and has mobility impairments from arthritis. And it is broad enough to encompass folks who are living with long-haul COVID. Disability can be temporary or permanent. You can be born with it or you can acquire it. It's hugely diverse and there are infinite ways that it can be experienced. And there is powerful magic in that, because that diversity of experience is our doorway to insight and innovation. Disability brings our bodies and minds back into the conversation. It helps us remember that we're human, that our bodies and minds can and will change over time, that our capacity will shift over time. It's a socially constructed identity, and it's one that you can choose. It's a culture and a community. It's a difference, not a deficit. It can and does impact all of us. It cuts across race, gender, class, religion, ethnicity, and every other facet of identity that you can think of. It is a universal, profoundly human experience. 1 in 5 people in this country has a disability. In the Black community, it's 1 in 4 of us. We're your sisters, your neighbors, your coworkers, your kids, and your friends. There is not a civil rights issue impacting marginalized folks in this country that doesn't disproportionately impact people with disabilities, all 61 million of us in this country. For example, 50% of the victims of police shootings are people with disabilities. Disability is deeply intersectional. It can impact us all, but it doesn't impact us all equally. If you're a member of another marginalized community, then ableism or disability discrimination is going to impact you more severely. So me, for example, I'm a Black disabled woman. So that means on any given day, I can experience racism, maybe swirl in a little bit of ableism through it, maybe sprinkle a little patriarchy on top. And that experience is not additive. It's not 1 + 1 + 1 = 3. It's a unique combination of systems of oppression that can create unique and dangerous harms that would not exist otherwise. So while we're talking about systems of oppression, let's define ableism. The best, most comprehensive definition that I know comes from T.L. Lewis, and here it is. Ableism is a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normality, intelligence, excellence, desirability, and productivity. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. This form of systemic oppression leads to people and society determining who is valuable and worthy based on a person's language, appearance, religion, and/or their ability to satisfactorily produce, excel, and behave. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. There are 2 things I want to call your attention to in that definition. The first is about behavior, that somebody might not have a choice about how they appear in public, about how they engage in public, whether they walk with a limp, if they speak with a stutter, if they use a communication device to communicate. If they're perceived as intellectually disabled or psychologically disabled, they're going to experience ableism, whether or not they have a diagnosis to go with it. And I think that those things I just wove together actually about this behavior piece and this idea that you don't actually have to be disabled to be on the receiving end of ableism. So it's just another way in which ableism can impact all of us. It's really critically important when we think about what it means to live in a society where we perpetuate or experience ableism. Also, that ableism is unique among other systems of oppression because it's used in service of other systems of oppression. It's used to perpetuate sexism and misogyny. It's used to perpetuate racism. But that also means that the more that we can weaken ableism, the more that we can weaken sexism and racism too. I'll give you a really old example. Back in the 1840s and 50s, when enslaved folks escaped from plantations, they were diagnosed with a psychiatric illness. They were told they had drapetomania. And the reason was social control. The reason was to apply the stigma of psychiatric illness to someone who was trying to fight against racism, to label someone crazy. You're crazy for wanting to be free. There's something wrong with you for wanting to be free. That's ableism used in service of racism. We think about the sexism example. Think about how many times you've heard women referred to as hysterical or neurotic. It's the same thing. So I made a big claim earlier, now that we've got definitions in place. I made a big claim. I said that if we'd centered disability in our organizations, we would have been better positioned to navigate COVID. And I need to back that up, right? That's what we do in scholarly work. So let me provide some examples. Pre-COVID, our workplaces were so hostile to disability, they were so ableist, that a study from Accenture revealed that only 20% of the 5,870 disabled employees that they surveyed, only 20% felt that their workplace culture was fully committed to helping them thrive and succeed. 76% of employees with disabilities in the survey reported not fully disclosing their disabilities at work. And what do I mean by not fully disclosing? I'll give you an example. Friends of mine who have disabilities that are visibly apparent, frequently hesitate to disclose the disabilities they have that are not visible. So I have a friend who's a wheelchair user. He typically does not tell people he has ADHD or dyslexia. Why? Because he's already experiencing so much ableism from the wheelchair. He doesn't want to open himself up to even more. And I relate to that. There's a hierarchy of disability. Studies indicate that non-disabled people have a much more favorable attitude toward physical disabilities, such as like being an amputee, as opposed to intellectual or psychiatric disabilities. So it is fairly easy for me to tell y'all that I'm a disabled person. That just rolls off the tongue, piece of cake. But telling you that I have bipolar disorder makes my heart race a little bit. Why? Think about how often in a given day you hear people casually throw around words like crazy and insane. Think about the context in which those words are used and the connotation attached to them. Think about what that says to people with psychiatric illness about how they're perceived and valued. Ouch, right? 80% of C-suite executives with disabilities don't disclose their disabilities because of fear of judgment or fear of retaliation or fear of loss of opportunity. And it's really sad because if you don't feel safe disclosing your disability, then it's a lot harder, possibly impossible, to get access to accommodations. It hurts engagement. Employees who disclose their disability at work are 30% more engaged in terms of career satisfaction, confidence, and sense of belonging. And all of this points to a failure of organizational culture. We did not have cultures that supported a practice of giving and receiving support. Our workplace cultures don't support us in developing the skill and capacity to say, I need help, and to feel confident that we'll be met with grace and not judgment. We don't feel confident that we can say, I don't know how to do this task the way they're asking. Can we co-create some kind of an alternative? How much easier would the pandemic have been if we all felt that we knew how to give and receive support, if we built that muscle, if we had a robust experience adapting to different ways of being and doing? Remember, this is all about conditions, thinking about what can thrive in the conditions that we're creating. We as a society have created conditions that allow COVID to thrive. If you think about American work culture that applauds people who work at all costs, it's common in this country. And I'm not talking about any particular organization, don't at me. I'm not, I'm speaking very, very broadly, but it is very common in the US to have a workplace culture that privileges and celebrates people who unfailingly show up and labor without breaks. Think about workplaces you've seen where people are celebrated for attendance and shamed for taking time off. I used to work in the restaurant industry. It is absolutely the case. You work through injury, you work through illness. It's like a badge of honor to work through pain. How does that drive COVID infections? How did that create conditions for people to go to work sick, to feel like they had no choice but to go to work sick and to try to work through illness? If we think about adapting to COVID life and how that could have been easier, remote work is a great example. Folks with disabilities and especially with chronic illness have been advocating for flexible work schedules and remote work options for decades, but are frequently denied that accommodation. And they're offered a range of reasons why. Everything ranging from cost to concern that it's going to undermine a sense of connection and cohesion among teams. But then what happened when the pandemic forced us to work remotely? We learned that remote work is something we have the capacity to do. We have the technology to do. We have the skill to do. We can learn it. We learned it's a helpful accommodation for a lot of people, parents and caregivers, for example. I've lost track of the number of articles that I've seen in HBR and the New York Times and the Washington Post about how women of color, especially Black women, experience far fewer microaggressions when working remotely and feel much safer doing their jobs. And connection. How many of us now know the names of our colleagues, partners, and children and pets because we've seen them on Zoom calls? The truth is, there are very few disability accommodations that don't create benefit for abled people too. It's a phenomenon called the curb cut effect. And the reason is really simple. Disability is a very normal part of the human experience, and humans have very similar access needs. That's why we can retire the euphemism special needs and why that euphemism is so problematic. These aren't special needs, they're human needs. We need the same things everybody else does. We need access, we need dignity, we need connection. It's very, very normal. Curb cuts are a great example. We made curb cuts and sidewalks so they'd be more accessible for wheelchair users, and then figured out, oh my goodness, this works really well if you're pushing a stroller. This works really well if you're a kid learning to ride a bike or a scooter. It works really well if you're a delivery driver with a cart full of packages. The entire sidewalk becomes a lot more accessible because we centered disability. Think about closed captions and how they're really wonderful for people who are deaf and hard of hearing. They're also really wonderful for people who are language learners. According to Angela Glover Blackwell, there's this ingrained societal suspicion that intentionally supporting one group is going to hurt another, that equity is some kind of zero-sum game. In fact, when we target support where it's needed the most, when we create the circumstances that allow those who've been left behind to participate and contribute fully, everyone wins. And the corollary is also true. When we ignore the challenges faced by the most vulnerable among us, those challenges, magnified many times over, become a drag on economic growth, prosperity, and collective well-being. So we know why it's a good idea to center disability. From a justice perspective, it's simply the right thing to do. It comes with the added benefit of creating opportunities for us to make our workplaces more welcoming and accessible and compassionate for everyone. Centering disability creates conditions for all of us to thrive. But how do we do it? We have to think beyond just knowing the right things to say and policing our language. We have to reach beyond just making sure things are physically accessible and work to transform the conditions that created inaccessibility in the first place. To go beyond the immediate needs of access, of resources, training, technology, and work to make sure inaccessibility doesn't happen again. It's about how we treat each other. It's about a culture of care. It's about seeing each other and engaging in that deep noticing. It's about challenging ourselves to lean into complexity and nuance, to unlearn what we've been taught to think about disability, to bring our bodies and minds back into the conversation, and to live our commitment to co-creating spaces that work for all of us. It's about access, but also about understanding that access is the floor, it's not the ceiling. And that if we're seeking to improve access and remove barriers out of a genuine desire to include, when our motivation comes out of our esteem for each other, then we're performing an act of love, of care, and of justice. And that's when access becomes liberatory. So to do that, we're going to lean into the principles of disability justice. There are 10. I'm only going to go through 6 of them for the sake of time, but I've sent some resources on to Carol so that she can circulate a link so you can get to the rest of them if you'd like. So first, the disability justice movement is something that comes from genius minds like Patty Byrne and Rebecca Coakley and Mia Mingus and a lot of other people. And I'm going to quote Patty Byrne here, that all bodies are unique and essential. All bodies are whole. All bodies have strengths and needs that must be met. We are powerful not despite the complexities of our bodies, but because of them. We move together with nobody left behind. This is disability justice. Imagine a workplace culture built around that statement. I want to work there. That sounds dreamy. So the first of the 6 that I'm going to introduce you to is intersectionality, which is a phrase that I'm sure, a term that you've probably heard many, many times, especially now that there's a really interesting conversation happening about critical race theory that I'm not going to get into today. Quite simply, intersectionality says that we are many things and that they all impact us. Nuance is our friend. Rather than dividing each other into silos, we can look for the places where identities and values intersect and find the wisdom there. Intersectionality helps us develop the capacity to hear and hold each other's stories, their whole stories. We shouldn't have to go to the margins of the margins of the margins to be seen and understood. I love it out here, right? I love to be in community with my other multiply marginalized folks, and that shouldn't be the only place that I get to be my whole self. For the multiply marginalized people who are here today, how many times have you been in rooms and you shared your truth only to be met with backlash, avoidance, blank faces, or awkward silence? Because people have not done their work to educate themselves to be able to meet you where you are. How many times has the conversation just continued on as if you've never shared at all because people just didn't know what to say? They hadn't built the capacity. In facilitation practice, we call that a plop. You're having a deep conversation, someone shares something vulnerably and it just kind of plops on the table and no one wants to touch it. It's so, it's like the opposite of validation. Leadership of the most impacted. This is where we lead with trust. What if we trusted people to know what they need? What if we trusted people to tell us what they need and to believe the answer? What if we seek out the wisdom of the most impacted people? So if racial justice is a top priority for your organization, what might it look like to not just seek out the perspectives of BIPOC folks, but to specifically center multiply marginalized BIPOC folks? To look for the people who are experiencing racism and ableism and patriarchy and learn about what needs to shift to create conditions for them to feel safe at work. Because trickle-down social justice doesn't work. Number 3, recognizing wholeness. This one's short and sweet. Disabled people are whole people. Disability is a natural, normal, common, expected part of the human experience. We are not broken and we don't need to be fixed. Number 4 has been the hardest one for me to learn. Oh my goodness, y'all. This is sustainability. This is about learning to pace ourselves. I'm not very good at that yet. It's a lifelong practice. Learning to pace ourselves individually and collectively. It's about valuing the teachings of our bodies and minds, using them as guides and reference points, about moving us away from urgency and toward the creation of a deep, transformative, unstoppable wave of justice. And in my own evolving relationship with my disability, this has been my hardest and most precious lesson. My disability is teaching me, I don't want to say it's taught me because I haven't mastered it yet, but it's teaching me to be honest with myself about my capacity, to be thoughtful about where I put my energy. It's taught me to protect my yes and only use it when I mean it. It's taught me that there's value in creating opportunities for others to offer their skills and support. And from this mindset in an organization, we can learn to ask an entirely different set of questions that shift our conditions toward disability justice. And my favorite question is this: how can I create ease for you? Not just access, ease. In this job interview, with this task, as we prepare for this meeting, how can I create ease for you? Because if we can create more ease for each other, then we'll be working in a way that's much more sustainable and deepening our connection to each other at the same time. Talk about team cohesion, right? And next, interdependence. I have to let you in on a little bit of a not so secret, because we don't like to believe this in the US, but it's true. Independence is a lie. Disability has taught me so much about the dangerous and privileged myth of independence. The myth of independence says we should somehow be able to do everything on our own without any help from anyone. Imagine the level of privilege necessary to make that happen. And even then, it's a myth. Tell me whose oppression and exploitation has to exist for that so-called independence to be possible. How many of us are relying on the labor of others and then being conditioned to call it independence? And it's an ableist notion. And it's in alignment with a lot of other ableist notions, this idea that we should never need or want to have a nurse. We should be able to drive ourselves everywhere we want to go. We should work hard to do everything on our own. But what does that accomplish? And what if instead we got really honest about our interdependence? What if we understood, for example, that we are only as healthy as our least insured and least vaccinated neighbor? What can interdependence look like in our workplaces? It's not just me dependent on you, and it's not you, the benevolent privileged person, deciding to help me. It's solidarity. It's understanding that we're more powerful together than we are apart, that there's no shame in needing help and giving and receiving care. And it's understanding that simply we need each other. And from this place of seeing our interdependence and the value of it, we can ask again, how can I create ease for you? And lastly, collective access. Understanding that access needs are not shameful, that we all function differently depending on context and environment. And when we're committed to collective access, we commit to bringing flexibility and creative nuance to our engagements with each other. We commit to normalizing giving and receiving support. Think about, imagine with me, dream with me a little bit, like a workplace culture that's designed around those 6 out of the 10 principles. We could get to we'll do a 2.0 where we get through all 10 of them. And now we get to start thinking about, what do we need to shift? What needs to shift so that our conditions, our workplace conditions, can be anti-ableist and pro-disability? How do we create conditions for disabled folks to feel safe disclosing their disabilities and access needs? How to create conditions where disclosure isn't even necessary, that we've already planned for disability because it's so common. So why not? We need trust. I think that's what needs to shift. We need trust. What if we trust people to know what they need to do their best work? And what do we need to do to help them trust us as organizational leaders? What does it cost us to lead with trust? Well, first of all, it demands that we reject scarcity. It demands that we trust that accommodations are not a zero-sum game. There's enough to go around as long as we're flexible and creative. What if we proactively offered accommodations and just trusted our team members to use them when and how they needed? What if we made inclusive anti-ableist practice our default position? Think about things like job interviews. What if we just offered job interview questions in advance? It's a great accommodation for folks with intellectual disabilities, folks with anxiety, folks with PTSD, also for folks who are language learners. It makes the interview more accessible so you can see someone showing up as their best self, able to do their best work. What about things like flexible work schedules that are helpful for just about everyone, from people with chronic illness to parents and caregivers? So I want to create some space for us to dream together a little bit. We're going to do some imagining, some brainstorming in small groups. And it's a choose your own adventure. So if you have the ability, please just grab a screenshot of this and feel free to discuss any of these prompts that are calling to you in your small group discussion. I think we're going to be in small groups for about 10 minutes, and then we'll come debrief together. If folks want to share back a little bit, like some key, like some insights that are really sticking with you, or any ideas that are tugging at you, we'd love to hear them in the chat or verbally, whatever feels more comfortable. We've got a couple of minutes.
I can share really quickly. We talked about intersectionality and the curb cut effect. What you elevated and uplifted in your talk was so helpful, that we need to center the margins, and everyone's better off when we think about those who are at the margins. So thank you.
Thank you. I think it forces us to get so creative when we're solving for a limitation, and then we find these amazing benefits to it. All right, in the chat, we've got someone sharing that it's important to give everyone grace, and we shouldn't have to wait for someone to disclose a disability before we assume they're doing their best. Can we like blow that up on a billboard?
In our small group, we talked a lot about building proactive things into the entire hiring process, including looking at what's in the job description about what expectations we can set around flexible work arrangement, work from home. Do you really have to lift 50 pounds?
Mm-hmm.
And making that very clear, and making the flexible work accommodation process, like the assumption is that you have access, but that has to be tied with training, like what you just provided to us this morning. Please come talk to our organization. And like really shifting attitudes, because we want to make sure that folks understand the accommodation process, but also shift all of the like internalized ableism that's driving us to make asking for accommodation like re-traumatizing.
Yeah. That's so powerful. Thank you. And I'd love to come talk to y'all. That would be really great. That's so important. I think if we could please stop always asking if people can lift 50 pounds. I've never understood why that goes in some of these job descriptions. It's really unnecessary. Talk about boilerplate language.
In our little group, we really got close about what kind of disabilities and how difficult it is to reveal it. And we realized that in looking at all of these prompts, the difference was going from thinking like an institution and about a demographic, and actually thinking in terms of a family member or someone we trust. We are more likely to bring up our disabilities if it's in a space of trust. So asking about whether or not we want to do it as we're applying for a job versus wanting to be part of a better team, are two different things. And so we found a lot of love and a lot of leaning towards, it's not just the institution and the costs and the benefits, it's more the person. Can we work towards making it easier for that person to work in our space?
Whew. That is so powerful. Thank you. It is a real, I think that the questions you ask in response to someone saying they need an accommodation shifts so drastically when you're thinking about that human, like what does Adana need to be able to do this job today, rather than this kind of institutional framing. It's a whole different ballgame. And it makes it so much easier to connect from that place of care and empathy. Like, I value you as a team member. I really want your contribution. Let me create some ease for you so that you can give this contribution because we're stronger because of it. That's amazing. All right, I guess I'll say my last couple of words. This is my big question. How can I create ease for you? It's my new favorite question. I think that, as I said, I can see my garden through my window right now. I'm watching this. There's this epic battle happening between two hummingbirds. It's kind of intense. They've been at it for about 3 days now. I learned they're very territorial. And so there's one that's decided this is her garden and she's defending her turf. And we've got an intruder. But something about gardening that I really love is that it's teaching me to think in seasons. Think about the idea that what's true today will not always be true, that needs are going to change and capacity is going to shift. And that's true for us as humans. 80% of disabilities that are acquired between the ages of 16 and 64. It's a community of people that any of us could join at any moment, which is not true of a lot of other different types of marginalized identities. So it's not a question of us and them, right? Because at any point we could be part of the us. And I think that organizations and the humans that work in them are the same, right? That we operate in this kind of seasonal modality, that things are going to change and they're going to shift. And it's completely reasonable for someone's capacity for production to vary. I think sometimes we have this feels very American to me too, this notion that people will show up. We talk a lot about consistency. You're going to show up the exact same way and do the same quantity of work and the same quality of work day after day after day, no matter what's happening around you. And that's just not realistic. So in this season of COVID, we have this opportunity to reimagine work. We have this opening, and we can use it to expand our understanding of equity and rebuild our systems to reflect the beautiful and messy and dynamic ways that humans show up in the world. We can challenge our assumptions, challenge our cultural values and expectations about productivity, and we can imagine new ways of measuring our contributions. And most importantly, we can reimagine what it means to plan and care for each other. We can reach beyond access and ask, how can I create ease for you? Disability justice really is about love. And there are varying reports about who said this first, so I'm not sure who to cite, but some brilliant person said that justice is what love looks like in public. I think that might have been Cornel West, but I could be wrong. It wasn't me. I would just make sure it's not my wisdom. I'm just sharing it. So as we plan our way forward together, we have to remember that we need each other, and that leaning into that interdependence, giving and receiving support, and centering the voices of marginalized disabled people unlocks the care and innovation that we all need to thrive. Half a century ago, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. prophetically wrote from a Birmingham, Alabama jail cell, "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects us all indirectly." Centering disability, that deeply intersectional, marginalized identity, that vibrant community with its culture of innovation and connection, is how we can move forward together and how we can co-create the conditions that we all need to thrive. Thanks so much for having me today. I would love to take any questions you have. Here's my contact info so you can reach out and we can continue our conversation. So if you're anything like me, you'll leave today and you'll think of 14 questions that you wish that you'd asked. So this way you don't have to just hang on to them. You can just email me. And I'm so excited to be here the rest of the day. It's going to be so fun. Thank you so much.